Welcome, everybody. I'm Kim Bohr, President and COO of SparkEffect, and the host of Courage to Advance podcast. Today, I am talking with Dr. Meisha Rouser, a recognized expert in organizational development, leadership, and change management with over 20 years of experience. And as an organizational behavioral scientist, her research on Gen Z in the workplace provides groundbreaking insights for creative, productive, and meaningful work environments that we all can benefit from. So let's begin. Welcome, Meisha, to the Courage to Advance podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate this.
So I am so excited you're here with us. Given your PhD, your expertise in organizational development, leadership, change management, I couldn't think of a better person to have this conversation about Gen Z in our workplace and what it means for everybody. So you and I did some talking beforehand. We talked about like what are some of these, way to think about Gen Z coming in. And one of the things you and I really definitely saw was like this isn't just one of these, oh, the kids these days, there's kind of this is just the phase they're going through, or it's really more transformational than that. And I want to really have our audience start off with you talking about how those old paradigms aren't serving us well, and the really some of that generational theory that you've really put a lot of work into through your PhD and the studies you've done. So please dive in.
Yeah, so it's interesting because everybody always talks about the new generation. Doesn't matter. I mean, it could have been 20 years ago, right? And always saying, "Oh, well, they're just being special," or we all had to go through the same thing. Yes, that is true. However, it is interesting that with Gen Z especially, I am noticing, and I think there is a bit of a more of a difference. And so part of it too, to put into context, a lot of people don't quite understand when we talk about generational theory. So just really quick, I'm not going to go deep into it, but just really quickly, generational theory is about when we were being raised, when we were kids and going through our young, even the kind of the young life of high school and such, what was going on in the world, what was going on, some significant things that impacted us, that it affects us and our beliefs and our behaviors that will carry on. And so each generation, that's why you'll find too, like the dates on generations, they kind of are kind of um, nebulous in a sense because it
Mm-hmm.
depends. So if you think about that then with Gen Z, so one of the big things about Gen Z, I'm not even going to get to COVID yet, but the financial crisis. So when the financial crisis hit, a lot of them, right around 2008, 2009, and then that lingering effect, a lot of them saw, if not their direct direct family members, friends being impacted by that, losing homes, losing jobs, not being able to find work. So because of that really influenced them. And then when we get into COVID and now a lot of them joined the workforce, that also had an impact on him. So that's what we're going to be diving in today then is a little bit of, okay, yeah, what do they bring that's unique? But also as leaders, what can we be doing to help them in this transition?
So when you talk about those ranges that are a little bit nebulous, I know my son is 18. He's a freshman in college, so he's in that Generation Z. But what is roughly that range that we know is currently that people are experiencing in the workforce?
Yeah, so I would say right around 1995 is when Gen Z starts. Now, the next generation we will see, but I think they're talking about right about probably around 2012, I think is what they're talking. Because that's going to be interesting too, to
Mm-hmm.
see the effects of that generation. But anyway, we're just talking about Gen Z for today. Um, but yeah, so right around 1995. And usually, so I would say right now it's about the 29-year-old, 29
Mm-hmm.
roughly on
Okay.
down.
Okay. So that's a really significant for several, for many people, they could have been in the workforce for 6 to 8 years already in the in a
Right.
post maybe college type of experience. So that's a lot of there's a lot of established workers already potentially in this
Yes.
generation. So, when we think about the what they've experienced, I mean, yes, you talked about, the the housing and things, you talk about COVID. I think we should talk a little bit more about COVID because even though we're past it, that those were formative years for this generation in a way that uplifted everything. And I'm curious what some of your the research you did were elevating some of those experiences of that generation.
Yeah, because that was it was really insightful for me. It gave me a lot of ahas in my research. And so one of the biggest things was the ones who, because my kids are, they were just starting to enter the workforce when I did this research. And it was interesting then talking to those individuals who had been in, who had started right out of college and boom, now it's COVID and they're working remotely. Because at least if you were in college, then you got to adapt, right? Where it's like, oh, we're changing now, we're doing everything online. Well, now some of these folks were just thrown in, and they're like,
Mhm.
okay, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't even know what the proper appropriate etiquette is to reach out to somebody, because that's another big one that I realized was when all of us go into when we transition from either high school or college, whatever, into the workplace, that's really where you learn professionalism. That's really
Mhm.
where you learn work ethic, right?
Mhm.
And we all went through, our times there. And that was something that a lot of these kids did not get. And so they're struggling, even to the point, too, which I thought was interesting. I had this, so my type of research wasn't just a survey that went out, fill out these generic things. My research was in-depth conversation with a variety of Gen Zs, because I wanted to ask them not just, okay, like, why is work-life balance important to you, but why? Why is that? Okay, so going back to COVID, it was interesting how many of them said, it's like, I feel like I'm behind because they assume that, yeah, now, even though I've been in the workplace for 2 or 3 years, that I should know all this stuff.
Mm.
Like, getting insurance. What does HSA mean? How do I invest? So it's interesting how much they're still trying to catch up.
Yes, I could totally relate to that with my son who, was this happened in his, I think it was last year of junior high into the first year of high school. And boy, did that just throw those key years of social interaction, learning, the social aspects of those awkward years just in a complete, upside down nature. And I know that a lot of the families that have had kids in the same age that we've talked about, it was the same thing where it's been, to your point, there has been some catch up to do with this generation to try to have them understand some of these nuances that they just didn't get in those first couple of years. And of course, it varies from state to state where people have lived,
But
which is in some ways kind of a challenge, right? Because it's not, since it wasn't uniform in that way, we do have this even bigger gap of experience in this generation. So I'm really curious too, when you think about the technology, and this generation's come up with technology in ways that generations previously haven't. What is some of that you're seeing as that kind of came through the research as opportunity, or maybe some of the challenges with this generation too, from the contextual standpoint?
yeah, it's interesting. Because where I want to go with that is more so that, like, a lot of people, for example, would say technology has impacted how we communicate with them. It was interesting in my research, not really. They love doing text messaging, right? And especially if they're busy and they're in the middle of something, but they do want those person to person conversations. If it's something important, if it's something they do want that connection. So it felt like that was somewhat similar. What I did find was interesting when we think about technology was more so social media's impact.
Mm.
So that one, what was interesting, and that I actually, my daughter kind of helped me piece that together because I'm looking at this research and I'm thinking something's still not clicking. And I was like, and especially because it came to like that work-life balance, where on one side, this generation is just they really, at least the ones that I talk to, are just ambitious. They want a chance to prove themselves. They want a chance to be successful. They want all of that. But yet at the same time, they're saying, yeah, well, but I don't want to have to work. I mean, I'm not going to work 80 hours a week.
Hmm.
And part of me is like, but where's that disconnect? And my daughter was the one, she's like, well, mom, it's social media. We are watching influencers from all over the world and that are doing all these things. And we're like, well, I want to do that too. And I was like, oh, now that is where I
Yeah.
think is the big difference too, where technology plays in.
That's a really important piece because we talk about the pros and cons, right, of that whole the digital world we're all now a part of. And I think, there's a lot of debate that's probably for another conversation. Yet in this world of expectation setting and breaking what previous generations have been thought about the norms to be, it really is it's moving us in a whole different direction. So when we think about the some of the key differentiators, what are some of those things that have stood out that you found in your research, but also in the experience you have in organizations?
Yeah, so the key ones. Okay, the one I like to address always up front is a little bit of, I still hear people saying kind of the entitlement thing with this
Mm-hmm.
generation.
Yeah.
And here's what I've learned with this, through the research, is let's just talk about pay, for example. Um, so their loyalty to a company is not the same. For them, this was consistent too. And especially now, I do got to say that the people I talked to, most of them went to college. So keeping that in mind, they've spent all this time. It was kind of like they were born and raised saying, you do all these check marks all through high school, and then you're going to do all these check marks when you get into college, and then you're going to have this, everything's going to work out great. Okay. So we saw how that went, and then they're stumbling their way in. But they also do feel like, though, they have busted their butt to get to where they're
Yeah.
at. And so the entitlement is more of they want to feel like they're making a difference. They
Mm-hmm.
want to feel like they're growing. They want to feel like the company appreciates them and values them. And if they're not getting that, then they'll go someplace else. So I had like a great example was in this one gentleman, he did such a great job of explaining it. He goes, if I had a company that was going to offer me $10 more, he goes, now, yeah, is it worth going through all the hassles to change employers, all this stuff? And he goes, probably not, but would I do it? Yeah, because it tells me that that other employer values me more. I was like,
Interesting.
wow.
Wow. Well, and I think let's talk about that a little bit more because what you and I have been talking about, what I'm experiencing with my son as a freshman in college is the prices are high. They trying to figure out how they can live. They're so concerned. My son is going to college in Montana and he was so frustrated because he's not a resident at the time. And he said, my vote can't count on trying to bring forward more affordable housing. And this idea of not wanting to be reliant on us beyond what the bare minimum is a driving factor for him. And yet he's coming up against these realities that it's like, how is he going to how do you bridge that gap? So the idea of higher pay starts to go into some basic survival needs, it seems.
Yes. And that was a really good point of a couple of things there. Is that one, that thing where they do not want to have to rely on us. Every single one I talked to, success to them was, I am doing this on my own. I thought that was interesting.
That is very
Even
interesting.
one of them who did end up was still living with his parents, but he's like, yeah, because if I want to be able to buy a house, okay, one, that's just out of the realm for most Gen Zs right now.
Mhm.
And he goes, I have to save up the money. And this is the only way I'm going to be able to do that. So yeah, the thing that with the higher prices, the cost of living, it is hard on this generation.
Yep. Yeah, and I think there's, the generations before of a mentality like you start off by saying like, hey, you put in the hours, you put your head down, you do the work, you climb through, and that is such a disconnect from not only how this generation is understanding and how they've kind of come into this world, yet it's also a disconnect of reality of like that the numbers don't add up. It just does not make sense. And so I think it's a really great point to reframe for all of us around this isn't that we shouldn't be thinking of this as entitlement. We should think about this as them literally trying to look out for themselves in a way of survival basic needs, not having to be relying on their families,
Yeah.
beyond a reasonable amount of time. And so what I also thought was interesting was that where the loyalties come into play. And so I think what do you feel like, the difference between some of the compensation that comes up with people and some of the needs, were there some other things that came out in your research that feels like it kind of helps give some clarity to listeners or those in organizations who are leading Gen Z right now, before we kind of start to dive into maybe what are some of the things organizations need to be thinking about?
Yeah. So let me mention a couple others. And when you talked about loyalty too, I thought that was interesting. So they may not have loyalty to the organization per se, but they will have loyalty. Managers are a big deal to them. If that
Mm.
manager is connecting with them, I was listening to some Gen Z podcasts, and they're even using the word empathetic management.
Oh,
I thought that was
interesting.
interesting too, because I had like one woman who she's like, she was able to quit and she was going on to get her master's, and she had like 6 or 7 months, and she goes, but I couldn't do it because I didn't want to leave my manager in a
Wow.
point. So there is that loyalty and so the influence of their relationship with their manager was definitely a make or break. The other thing that they really are needing is understanding what are my expectations? Because like so many of them would say, okay, well, here I have, was doing sales, this one gentleman doing sales. He's like, so I had figured out, I knew what my quota was and what I needed to do. He goes, I figured out how to get there in the most efficient way because I want to go mountain biking, I want to go skiing, I want to go to these other things. But instead of being rewarded, he goes, I'm given more work. I don't get a
Mm.
raise. I don't. And so they're just like, what the heck? What are these
Yeah,
expectations? How do I advance? What is expected of me? And then how am I going to grow? Because
right.
again, they also realize, like we were saying earlier, they need to keep making money.
Hmm.
So how am I learning? How am I growing? What am I being exposed to? Those were also really big.
I think the loyalties piece is so interesting when you think about all the research that, the Gallup research and all the other organizations I've done research around, people leave for their managers. And to see that is so important with this generation who's asking for development. They're asking for clear expectation setting, which isn't always the sweet spot of leaders at times, especially, perhaps earlier tenured leaders in roles, managers. And I think that, that is also really interesting to hear if I can make it happen, it's like, why are you moving the goalpost on me? That's not what we agreed to. And that could create a lot of tension and disconnect. So, coming from your background, and having this research behind you, I think you and I have been talking about there's a lot that organizations can do, and it shouldn't really be the cookie cutter approach to perhaps how it's worked with generations prior. And so I'd love for us to dive a little bit into that and talk about what are some of these things that organizations should really be thinking about. And I think one of the pieces that jumps out immediately is really like, what are the generational differences that managers and leaders need to be trained on? What are some things that have popped out to you that from kind of that worldly experience you have?
Yeah, I would say if with like with the coaching that I do with leaders, especially around the struggles they're having with Gen Z, I've been finding it's really helpful if as leaders, any type of understanding that they can have around behavioral differences, communication
Mm.
styles, so for example, like a DISC or, a Myers-Briggs even, or even something of understanding learning styles. Are they visual,
Hmm.
auditory, kinesthetic? A great example of that would be, for example, one woman I was working with. Oh, she was just the sweetest thing and very empathetic, but was still having such a difficult time connecting with her employee who was Gen Z. And we did a DISC assessment, and I had them both do it. And that totally opened up. She goes, oh my gosh. So when I thought what you needed to hear for clarity on expectations, I was giving it to you the way she was wanting it. not the way the other woman was. And so she was like, oh, as soon as I realized, oh, okay, let me explain it a different way. Huge difference. And so they were able to
Yep.
make that connection. So that one's also a big one with feedback because they want feedback, they want it timely, they want to learn, they want to know, how can I grow and so forth. So also how to give them feedback,
Yes.
understand who they are because everybody wants it different.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point that I want to go a little bit deeper on. When you talk about the assessments, one of the ones that I'm a huge fan of is the Harrison assessment because it looks at it from a
Yes.
behavioral standpoint, right? And it pairs
Yes.
so nicely with understanding, even like when you think about the disc and some of these others, there's a lot of complementary nature to having that level of depth and understanding. And one of the things about feedback is I think sometimes we've construed feedback for being constructive when really it's both. And I think what I've heard from you and experience with my own son is that they're looking for more tangible feedback that is both what should I be doing more of and what is more constructive, but not just a good, attaboy. That's really not that feels hollow to them and they sense it and they don't, that's not what they're looking for.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that reminds me too of one of the other big ones. And this is one of the things I love about this generation. And you mentioned it briefly in the beginning of the old paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
They love to ask why. And again,
Yes.
I love that because it's like, why? Just because my manager's working 80 hours a week, totally neglecting his family, why do I have to do that to be promoted? And they're asking valid questions that a lot of us have been like, yeah, but we just kind of sucked it up and we're just doing it.
Because we were told to do it.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And I really think this generation is finally like, okay, I get it. You all don't want to do this. Well, let's change it then. I love how like they're bringing up 30-hour work weeks. We're actually starting to do research into that. It works. So
Yes.
they're getting us to think differently, to think of things in it from a different paradigm.
Yes. And I think that's so important because that is a very different trait from generations prior. And that, many of us were taught you don't question authority. You don't quite, right? And that's so counterproductive in adult life in most work instances. Perhaps except the military, but it's very challenging when you now have somebody who's like, but I'm going to keep asking why because they need to have it needs to make sense for them. And it so ties into the loyalty and the engagement and all these other really important factors. So I think when we talk about some of the training, understanding that feedback, what are some of the, some just, I mean, it's a skill set. And I think if managers don't have it, organizations need to be investing in them with that skill set.
Yes.
There's other things too that you brought up and I thought was so important around just some of the basic necessities, things that, you found through some of your own experiences that they're just not, they're looking for and not getting, and just some of the stuff to help them be more self-sufficient. Love for you to
Yeah.
expand on some of that too.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it would be some of the literally the basics, financial planning,
Mhm.
how to start saving up for a house if they even can, how to invest. This
Yeah.
one's a personal one, but like even my son. So I was making sure I'm like, okay, so you're doing the 401k that your employer offers. And he's like, oh yeah, 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 yeah. And then I was talking to him about something differently, and I realized, did you go into that whatever portal it is that your money's in and invest it, make sure they're investing it for you? And he's like, no, it's just going in there. I'm like, oh yeah, honey, you can invest that money. It can make money for you.
Yeah.
Little things like that, again, benefits, work-life balance is a big one to help them how to do, they knew how to do time management in college, but it's different now.
It's different.
Yeah, so there's those types of things. And here's the other thing too that, and it kind of goes back to what with them always asking why, is turn it around too. Remember, as leaders, we don't have to have all the answers. That's
Right.
where our coaching comes in. Ask them, well, what do you think? How would you do this? What is it that you're needing some help with? How would you do it differently with work-life balance? Yes, I know you want to have your skiing vacations while also working. So how are you managing those? How can we do it so you can do both of those?
Yeah.
So just engaging them in those.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that also stands out to me, and maybe some listeners are thinking about this, is like, where's the fine line between providing things that perhaps they should have gained versus being in this work world? And I think, you know, I think you and I have a very, probably a very similar perspective. Like the work world has evolved to whole person. And yet, is there something there that you would be advising people to from that paradigm shift that's needed?
Yeah, definitely. And that's and I love it too because we're not saying, just roll over and just let them,
Right.
be them, right? They love structure. Because again, think about it. They've received a checklist their entire life. All I got to do is check this off. So provide that checklist. Here are your expectations. This is what I'm expecting of you. You can do it down to anything from the hours you're expecting of them to how often, that you want to be meeting with them. It could be everything from also how to get that promotion because they
Mm-hmm.
want to know they want to move towards it. The one thing I've seen that's challenging, though, that leaders have, and this goes back to understanding them and their own, way of how they learn, how they grow, how they communicate. You do need to communicate that in a way that resonates with them.
Mm.
So even though you're giving, the templates, I call it creating boundaries and then total freedom within those boundaries. But they need to
Yes.
really understand what those boundaries are.
I really agree with that. I think the boundaries are huge. And I think there's so much assumption in our day-to-day business world where we think we hire very skilled people and we think that they can figure it all out for themselves. And we do a disservice when we don't actually create the boundaries. And sometimes I think leaders are uncomfortable with boundaries themselves. And so they don't think about bringing them forward and the benefits of them. And so there's some certainly some reframing there that's opportunity. I think another thing that really, stands out to me when we think about the paradigm shift is there's all these edge cases that we hear about, somebody's mother went with them to an interview. And I think that we want to really caution people to not stereotype that into this generation, because I know nobody in my network of this generation who've have that kind of approach. And so I would say please don't bring that into what you're thinking about, and saying that the whole generation is really of this nature. It's since we know it's really
Right.
not. So when we think about this idea of like, okay, so what can people do if they have people on their team right now, or they know that they're hiring a workforce that this generation is very much filled with. How do we think about giving leaders the ability to have greater capacity in their level of empathy, understanding, curiosity? What are some things that that come to mind? I know we started to talk a little about feedback. Is there some more things specifically that you're thinking of from your own experiences too?
Yeah, and thinking about because when I think of all the different types, is remember that, so people are people. We are going to be different. We're all wired
Mhm.
differently. We're all going to be taking information in differently. I think still that is probably the biggest difficulty for leaders is how do I do like for example, some Gen Z, like all people, are going to be more introvert. They're not going to ask as many
Mhm.
questions and so forth. So again, coaching skills are huge to be able
Mhm.
to understand and to meet them where they're at. Coaching skill, I mean, just the grow coaching model is such a simple one to be able to help with that.
Mhm.
Check-ins, giving feedback. How do they want feedback? I can't tell you, there was a number, I had at least two of them say, okay, they think they're giving me feedback by calling me out and saying how great of a job I did in front of the entire team. That just mortified them. And they were just like,
Yes.
so it's little things like that that you need to be able to ask them, not just like, how do you want feedback? Because some of them may
Yeah.
not know. I've always found it easier to say, hey, when you received feedback in the past that you felt like you did a really good job, why did you feel that way? What
Right.
was it that your manager did?
Yes. And I think it's what you just said too is such an important nuance of recognition. People have varying degrees on that continuum of what recognition means. There's the people who absolutely want to be on the stage, and some people are maybe just a simple thank you, and some people are just don't even want that. They just want to be recognized through pay or through, their ability to promote things like that, right? So I think it's so important to actually ask versus just assume that it's going to be well received by everybody. I think you also talked about the regular check-ins. I think that's so important, and I do know in the work we do from the coaching lens and the teamwork lens, it is there. That's often um, not as highly prioritized as a regular opportunity. And the other thing I've noticed is that oftentimes managers come in with their own agenda, and then they miss what is actually the most important thing that they should be talking about with their people. And so I think that's something that for those listening, thinking about what is that regular agenda cadence, what should be included so that it's not just at them, but it's truly a collaborative conversation. And what are some other things that, you mentioned some of the clear, kind of clear expectation settings, or anything else in that area you would want to make sure listeners are kind of keeping top of mind?
Yeah, and you made me remember another big one that I'll usually get asked a lot is, do they want to work collaboratively or not?
Mm,
And that one is, yes, both and. So they
yes.
do like working collaboratively, and they do want to be an individual contributor in the sense that they don't want to be held back also sometimes from working just in
Yeah.
a group. So there's a balance there too of making sure that you can give them both space in both of those.
So that kind of leads us into the reality of the hybrid environment that most organizations are still in. I know some are moving more towards in person, yet I think the majority are still going to be in this mixed kind of, mixed media type of a space. So what are some of the recommendations you think listeners could really take in consideration when we have that kind of environment? Because I think you and I would agree that not all managers are effective in managing in remote environments as they would be maybe if they were in a in-person environment.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Okay. There's um one, they're very comfortable with
Mm-hmm.
that. I think they do like the in-person when they can get it, but they do lean towards a hybrid environment or a remote environment just so they can have better work-life balance.
Mm-hmm.
Some things I did think though that was very interesting. And this came back. So Gallup has always said, like what are those things that engage employees? And one is to
Mm-hmm.
have a best friend at work.
Mm.
Now, here's what was different for them. For Gen Z,
This,
it appears to be more of because they are online, they're communicating with their best friends. They're there, right? So they
mm-hmm.
have that already. But they do want that personal connection. Again, there was a few times they're like, I want to know that these aren't just, I want to know who this person
Yeah.
is. So to also create time, and that's something that I think if managers could do more of that, especially if they're in a remote environment, of creating time where it's not just all we jump on a call, it's just all work and we jump off.
Yeah.
To find all the different ways of how to connect as people as well.
Yes. And that's challenging I think, for most organizations, I think are still that have a hybrid or fully virtual environment. I think that is a challenge,
Hmm.
to figure out how do we bring that in authentically, especially when change is so constant, as you and I have
Yes.
talked about. So how do is there anything in particular you would call out for people to think about creating that psychological safety in these more hybrid or virtual environments that, maybe shifts at all for this generation?
Um, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of it already, of understanding who they are, understanding
Mm-hmm.
the team, knowing that you're there for them, um, creating the space to hear, what is it that they have to contribute to, giving them, the ability to chime in, asking their opinions. When giving feedback too, like with feedback, you want to also always make sure that it's about the behavior or whatever it is they're doing, good or bad.
Yeah.
It's not about the person, right? So that's one thing, always want to separate the two and give, you want to give good feedback in addition to opportunities for growth. It's all those things. If they feel like that you have their back and that you're trying, they pick up on that. I think that's the
Yeah.
biggest thing. And then anything you can do to help them out, just kind of take them under their wing, when they're doing something. Don't assume that they know all these adult
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah. And don't take for granted that they don't bring value. I think that was the other thing. When we think about managing those multi-generational teams, I have heard of some organizations trying to be, although I don't think this is mainstream yet, but trying to be more collaborative with this Gen Z and other generations to help knowledge transfer in different ways,
Yes.
knowing that the digital no man land that they've come from has a tremendous value. And so try to not, say like, well, you don't get it on either party's part, but really trying to figure out how does that look like that we could have more cross um, functional generationally learning and try to leverage one another in a more productive way there too.
Yes, because that was something too that they really, and this was consistent with everybody as well, is they value learning from as much as they can. And so some like so many of them said, "Yeah, I'm trying to meet with this one guy before he retires because he just has this wealth of knowledge." And so that kind of goes back to a little bit also what's a little different though is that I don't care if it's your if it's their leader, their manager, a coworker, you've got to earn their respect
Mm,
if they're going to really, be respectful back. Um, but so that's one element of
mm,
that you just can't like, people were trying and so many times it's like, okay, we're gonna connect them and mentor, a younger one with the old. Well, if they don't respect that person, it's gonna go out the door. And so you may even want to have that conversation of, hey, I would love to get you connected with a mentor in the organization, help them to connect with that older generation. And then it's great for the older
mhm.
generation because they love it. I mean,
Yes,
they love sharing their information with others.
that's really, and so it's got to have that intentionality is really, really key. So I think, as we kind of start to wrap up the conversation, I think we've maybe touched a little bit, but I think I'd like to be more intentional around, let's dive into some of the pitfalls that organizations and managers need to be thinking about so that they don't, have more undoing of behaviors than they, want to have. So I know one thing that, we've talked about is that over trying to not over focus on these ideas of perks, but that for things to be very meaningful and
Mhm.
also to balance that growth opportunity for Gen Z in ways that also can help them see what they're going to gain from it. So really trying to be more intentional and maybe more not just for it to be more meaningful, right? What
Yeah.
are some of the other things that you've maybe would kind of caution listeners around?
Yeah, so the perks I think are good in the sense of recognize what the perks are really for. Like some people would mention pizza parties. They're like, okay, if the party was a reward because we worked all this overtime, no. But if the pizza party is an opportunity for all of us to get together and get away from
Yeah.
work and just that's different.
Such a good example. Oh my goodness. That is and the intention, right? It's the intent behind that is so big. I love that. I know, another one is, that you mentioned it, right? That clear structure and expectation setting. So
Yes.
really put the effort in, which it does take more time. And yet the return is going to be there. It's going to be there for everybody. How would you say, we talked about the economic challenges that, Gen Z is facing. How could organizations, we talked about some of the learning stuff, but is there anything else that they could do to kind of avoid that pitfall that's going to have maybe that generation turning over more and more?
Yeah, and that one too, because a lot of times, yeah, the economic side of things, yeah, it's out of a lot of our managers' hands, right? It's just, it is
Yeah.
what it is. But there are so many other things that have value for Gen Z that you could also add in there. Get them with a mentor. They want to grow, give them some
Mhm.
training, sit down with them and even mentor them, give them a special project, ask them what else, maybe even cross training. Maybe they'd be curious to do something. I mean, there's so many
So much.
ways that there's value that you could bring to them maybe they want to work one of the days out, instead of coming into the office 3 days a week, they want another. There's so many ways to
So
bring in
much.
value
Yeah.
that will help them stay in the organization.
I love that. And I think, the one of the last ones that you've really hit home too is just the human connection part. So being
Mhm.
authentic and finding those ways for them to connect not just with each other, but with others, across the organization is really key.
And
So,
I just thought of one more too, is
yeah.
also, and remember, everybody's wired differently, but knowing that they're making a difference can also
Mm,
be really key for the majority of them. So what is the impact of what they're doing? And so
I
even
like
if
that.
it's just making somebody's day, they're like, okay, there was meaning behind that. That's a big one to
Yes.
remember too.
That's so important, not just for this generation, but I think we do make assumptions that everybody knows, like, hey, you come to work and then here's our values and mission on the wall, and like you make the connecting points. And obviously that's a big disconnect for some. And I think just being able for people to say like why my work matters is really important. And for this generation, it's even more significant.
Yes.
Well, Misha, as we wrap up the conversation, is there anything else you want to share with the listeners that helps them kind of think, rethink, and reframe around this Gen Z?
The only thing I would say is I still, like I said, I am so excited about what this generation is going to bring, what they're going to be
Yes.
changing. They're just going to be, they're so creative, they're so imaginative, they're so collaborative in so many ways. So kind of our job, if we can help foster that, it's going to be
Yes.
amazing.
I agree. And it's about shaping and not discounting. We
Right.
really have to accept that there's a tremendous value in this generation, and we need to not delay in bringing them into the fold and learning from them. Well, Misha, thank you so much for the time today, for sharing your insights from your work. I hope our listeners have been able to take some nuggets away. For all of those who are listening, we always have our free resources relevant to the conversation today that you can download by visiting courage2advancepodcast.com. And that will take you to our Spark Effect podcast page where you can get not only the resources from today, but even if you want to check out some of our past episodes. And so, again, thank you so much for your insights. I really am also grateful to the Empathy Edge for hosting our podcast subseries, and to our listeners for tuning in to our episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about having the courage to find them. Thank you so much. Talk soon.